The 5th Territorial Force Battalion of the Bedfordshire Regiment originated from the Rifle Volunteer Corps created in 1860. That said, the local informal volunteer forces, which were the Volunteer Corps' predecessors, existed in the county from the 18th century. For your information, the history of the volunteers is covered in another video, for which I'll put a link in the description below. The Territorial and Reserve Forces Act 1907, also referred to as Haldane's Reforms, saw the formation of a national-level territorial force, which superseded the volunteer force. As a result, the East Anglian Division was one of 14 to be formed entirely from part-time territorial units, including the contingent from Bedfordshire. The volunteers from the 3rd Bedfordshire Volunteer Battalion were amalgamated with the 4th Huntingdonshire Volunteer Battalion and transferred to the newly established Territorial Force, becoming the 5th Territorial Force Battalion of the Bedfordshire Regiment. Companies A through F were formed from the old Bedfordshire Volunteer Battalion, with G and H coming from the Huntingdonshire Battalion. As at the 1910 return of strength, the battalion was commanded by Lieutenant Colonel Spencer Jackson, DSO, and was organised as follows. Battalion HQ was at Bedford, with offices at St Paul's Square, the headquarters and orderly room at 44 and 45 Gwynn Street, and the drill hall at Greenhall Street. A company was based at Bedford and was commanded by Captain Richard Rouse Orlebar, with the senior NCO and drill instructor being Sergeant Major Ernest Mendham. B Company was based at Luton, with the company headquarters at Park Street. Major Edgar William Brighton was in command, as well as being in overall command of the South Bedfordshire contingent. C Company was also based at Luton, with the company headquarters at Park Street and a detachment at Ampthill, whose drill hall was at Dunstable Street. The company was commanded by Lieutenant Robert Forrest, who would go on to lead the battalion between 1923 and 1924, with Sergeant John Bunker being the senior NCO. D Company was based at Biggleswade, with detachments at Sandy, Arlesey and St Neots. Company headquarters was off Hitchin Street in Biggleswade, and the company was commanded by Captain Christopher Henry Frank Metcalf, with the senior NCO being Colour Sergeant Instructor F. Merritt. E Company was based at Ampthill with a detachment at Olney. F Company was also based at Luton, with the company headquarters also at Park Street, and detachments at Dunstable and Leighton Buzzard. G Company was based at Fletton in Huntingdonshire with a detachment at Yaxley, and H Company was based at Huntingdon, with detachments at St Ives and Ramsey. Whereas some regions in the newly created Territorial Force initially had problems recruiting, Bedfordshire didn't. By 1909, the battalion had 24 officers and 738 rank and file, of the full maximum peacetime contingent of 29 officers and 980 men. Territorial Force soldiers drilled monthly at the local drill halls and took part in divisional level manoeuvres every summer, usually for 2 weeks. The summer camps, as they were referred to, between the Territorial Forces formation and the Great War were in 1909 at Hunstanton, between the 31st of July and the 14th of August, in 1910 at Ipswich, between the 30th of July and 13th of August, in 1911 at Thetford, between the 29th of July and 12th of August, in 1912 they went down to Worthing, between the 28th of July and 11th of August, in 1913 they were at Shorncliffe, between the 27th of July and 10th of August, and 1914 at Ashridge Park near Dunstable. Before 1912, the 5th Battalion carried no colours, but the generosity of Alexander Alston from Sharnbrook remedied that when he provided both the King's and regimental colours, which were presented in a ceremony at Bedford Park on the 20th of June 1912. At that time the battalion was still organised into 6 Bedfordshire companies, A through F, and 2 Huntingdonshire companies being G and H. February 1914 saw the Huntingdonshire companies absorbed into the newly formed Huntingdon Cyclist Battalion. As a result, the battalion's strength dropped to just over 500 and the remaining companies were reorganised. Since January 1912, the battalion had been commanded by Lieutenant Colonel Francis Noel Butler, with Major Edgar William Brighton as the second in command. Battalion headquarters remained the same, but company headquarters were now organised with A Company at Bedford, commanded by Captain John Wellesley Taylor, with the senior NCO still being Sergeant Major Ernest Mendham. B Company covered a wider area and was based at Dunstable, with a detachment at Leighton Buzzard and the company headquarters still at Park Street and Luton. The Leighton Buzzard office was at the Town Hall and commanded by Major Edgar William Brighton, and Captain Christopher Henry Frank Metcalf commanded the Luton element of B Company. C Company was also at Luton, with the company headquarters also at Park Street, but commanded by Major John Clutton. D Company was at Biggleswade and commanded by Lieutenant Rudolph Meade Smythe, with the senior NCO being Colour Sergeant Instructor Herbert Hutchins. E Company was based at Ampthill. F Company was at Luton, with the company headquarters also being at Park Street, but commanded by Captain Brian Clark Cumberland, and the senior NCO and drill instructor being Sergeant F Cowley. G Company was also now at Luton, with the company headquarters also at Park Street. An H Company was now in Bedford, commanded by Captain Walter Hendrick Meakin, with the senior NCO being Sergeant Instructor H. Munson. In a letter to the county newspaper dated the 20th of July 1914, Hess H. Whitbread, President of the Bedfordshire Territorial Force Association, reported on the condition of the county's Territorial Force units. The normal establishment of the battalion is 28 officers and 990 rank and file. On April the 1st, the strength of our 6 Bedfordshire companies was 18 officers and 511 rank and file. Today, the county furnishes the whole 8 companies with a strength of 27 officers and 954 rank and file, and it is certain that the stream of recruits has not yet ceased to flow. The other units of the citizen force of the county are in a very satisfactory condition, the Bedfordshire Yeomanry actually being over establishment. The county now furnishes to the Territorial Force practically 1% of the entire population of men, women and children. The 5th Beds Battalion, together with the Hertfordshire, Cambridgeshire and Northamptonshire battalions, now form a brigade of 4 battalions, each of which is 95% of its full establishment. In what would be their last peacetime summer camp at Ash Ridge that July, the men were paraded in full dress uniform on the 2nd of August, and were initially surprised to hear the camp was being struck the following day. But they quickly came to understand what it meant, and that they only had a few days at best to get their affairs in order. At 6:17 p.m. on the 4th of August 1914, orders arrived at the Gwyn Street headquarters in Bedford to mobilise, or, as in the case of the Territorials, to be embodied for service. The 5th Bedfordshires would spend their entire war within the 162nd Infantry Brigade, 54th East Anglian Infantry Division. The division was comprised the 161st Essex, the 162nd East Midland, and the 163rd Norfolk and Suffolk Infantry Brigades, with the 162nd being composed of the 1st 5th Battalion of the Bedfordshire Regiment, the 1st 4th Battalion of the Northamptonshire Regiment, the 1st 1st Battalion of the Hertfordshire Regiment, who left in November 1914, the 1st 1st Battalion of the Cambridgeshire Regiment, who left in February 1915, the 2nd 1st Battalion of the Cambridgeshire Regiment between February and April 1915, the 1st 10th Battalion of the London Regiment from April 1915, and the 1st 11th Battalion of the London Regiment also from April 1915. The initial expectation that the division would be sent overseas at an early date soon faded as they went through a series of war stations around East Anglia. After initially concentrating at Bedford in August, they moved to Romford in Essex after a couple of weeks. The battalion's first death came long before they went into the firing line, when Private 3388 Benjamin Seabrook from Dunstable was killed by an express train on the 27th of August 1914 whilst guarding a railway bridge near Manningtree. September 1914 saw the division dispersed around East Anglia, with the Bedford stationed in the area in and around Newmarket and Bury St Edmunds, and now under the day-to-day command of Lieutenant Colonel Edgar William Brighton, after Lieutenant Colonel Francis Noel Butler had been incapacitated by a serious bout of influenza. That month also saw the formation of a second-line unit, initially titled as the 5th Reserve Battalion, which would remain a home-based unit when the 1st Line Battalion went on active service overseas. November 1914 saw the main 5th Battalion reorganised from their pre-war structure of 8 companies to 4 companies, being labelled A through D. A Company was formed from the old B and C companies under Captain Brian Clark Cumberland, their senior NCO being Colour Sergeant Major 2219 Edgar Thomas Odell. B Company was formed from the old F and G companies under Captain John Edgar Hill, with the senior NCO being Company Sergeant Major 4391 Walter T. Brazier. C Company was formed from A and H companies under Captain Walter Hendrick Meakin, their senior NCO being Company Sergeant Major 2092 Alec Milton, who would go on to win the Military Cross, Distinguished Conduct Medal, Territorial Efficiency Medal and Bar, and the French Médaille Militaire. D Company was formed from the old D and E companies under Lieutenant Rudolph Meade Smythe, the senior NCO being Company Sergeant Major W. Goby. In January 1915, Lieutenant Colonel Edgar William Brighton permanently assumed command of the battalion, and the 5th Battalion was designated as the 1st 5th Battalion. At the same time, the 5th Reserve Battalion was redesignated as the 2nd 5th Battalion, the latter serving within the 69th 2nd East Anglian Division, as a part of the Home Forces until disbanded in February 1918. Later that year, the 3rd 5th Battalion was also raised purely as a draft finding and training battalion. In March 1915, the 1st 5th Battalion moved from Bury St Edmunds to Norwich, and then on to St Albans in May, where specialist training was stepped up. With overseas service rapidly approaching, around 20 officers and 800 men of the battalion, the other 15 officers and 200 men being kept back for specialised training in St Albans, set off on a farewell to the county march around Bedfordshire. Initially forming up in Luton on the 3rd of June 1915, and then marching to Dunstable, They received a civic reception there before being moved to an overnight camp in fields around Houghton Regis. Day 2 saw them march through Toddington, Westerning, Flitwick and Ampthill, being heartily cheered along the way, before marching through the throngs of onlookers in the county town and receiving another civic reception in Bedford town centre. An overnight camp in the fields next to the Kempston Barracks followed, before their 6 a.m. reveille started their long march on Saturday the 5th of June 1915 on what would be an extremely hot day. Setting off due south down the A6, the battalion marched through Clophill and Stilso before being called to a halt at 10:30 at Barton le Clay. There, the men enjoyed a brief rest in the rising heat before moving on to Luton. Local newspapers reported that scenes of enthusiasm unparalleled in the history of Luton greeted them as they struggled to march through the huge crowds en route to their next civic reception at the Luton Town Hall at 7 p.m. Returning to their St Albans station, their final stages of training continued until orders arrived for the division's deployment overseas. On the 25th of July 1915, hot climate uniforms were issued, making it clear that the Western Front was not beckoning, and a farewell service for the battalion was conducted by the St Albans Abbey. That night the battalion were ordered to hurriedly collect all stores and equipment, and they set off for the south coast on a series of trains. The battalion left Devonport on the 26th of July 1915, bound for somewhere out east. After a brief stopover in Egypt, which was far too short to offer any degree of acclimatisation for the troops, they moved on to Gallipoli, where they would serve between the 10th of August and 4th of December 1915. Within days of their arrival, and having had nowhere near enough time to acclimatise to the midsummer Mediterranean heat, the 3 battalions from the 162nd Brigade who had landed on the peninsula were committed to battle. They were tasked with capturing the inhospitable area, including a geographical feature named Kidney Hill, which covered the eastern flank of the 10th Irish Division's assault along the ridge of the Kirit-Tepe-Surt. During the battle on the 15th of August 1915, a staff officer was watching their progress through his binoculars. Seeing the battalion's metal flashes glinting in the sun as they doggedly advanced under heavy fire, he apparently remarked, "By Jove, if we only had 1 or 2 more battalions of those yellow devils, we should be across the peninsula by tomorrow." And with that, the battalion's nickname, the Yellow Devils, was born. But by the day's end, their determined assault resulted in 50% of the men who advanced becoming casualties. That was almost all of the company officers and around 300 men. The next 3.5 months saw them endure trench life in the Anzac area on Gallipoli, with frequent trench raids organised to assert their dominance, although combat casualties were relatively light and sickness reduced the battalion to the size of a very small company. Only a pitifully small number of them were left by their evacuation from Gallipoli in December 1915, with just 9 officers and 165 men fit to take the field on Christmas Eve 1915, which was after several weeks of rest and with reinforcements trickling back to rejoin the battalion from local hospitals. The division was moved back to Egypt to be rebuilt, and between January and March 1916 the Bedfords took on several large drafts from home. As it happens, these were mainly regulars who had recovered from their wounds received in the 1914 and 1915 fighting. With that, a year-long stint guarding the Suez Canal from the threat of an Ottoman attack followed. The only combat operations over 1916 occurred when flying columns were formed to destroy Ottoman outposts in the Sinai Desert, in readiness for the expected British advance into Palestine. From February 1917, the battalion advanced east towards Gaza with the British and Commonwealth forces, taking part in all 3 battles of Gaza in March, April and November 1917. In July 1917 they raided an Ottoman position in front of Gaza called Umbrella Hill so effectively that their actions formed the basis for all future raids in that area. It also led to the creation of the 54th Divisional insignia, that being an umbrella blown inside out. After the capture of Gaza in November, which saw the Bedfords conduct a frontal assault against the coastal flank of the Ottoman position, the battalion were engaged in the defensive actions east of Gaza during November and December 1917, operations in the Jordan Valley between February and May 1918, and the Battle of Megiddo that September, in addition to many skirmishes as they pursued the retiring Ottoman forces throughout the summer of 1918. By the time of the armistice in October 1918, they were stationed at Beirut, having spent their entire overseas service in the Mediterranean theatre. Private Samuel Needham was awarded the battalion's only Victoria Cross for his actions on the 11th of September 1918, when his berserk fury saved his entire patrol from annihilation. For reasons not recorded, he appears to have taken his own life while in barracks on the 4th of November 1918, just days after the armistice with the Ottoman Empire was signed. The battalion was disembodied in June 1919 while stationed at Beirut, and reformed in February 1920 at Bedford, once more as a part-time territorial battalion. Soldiers in this theatre of war suffered dreadfully from illness, with the battalion losing considerably more men to local disease than enemy fire. According to Captain Webster's 1913 history of the battalion, 26 officers and 750 ranks left England in July 1915, with 231 officers and 4,939 ranks reinforcing the battalion during the war. 17 officers and 202 rank and file were killed, with 29 officers and 660 ranks wounded in action. Just 1 officer and 10 men were taken prisoner. Hence, sickness accounted for the largest number of casualties by far, totaling 116 officers and 4,125 of the rank and file. After the war, the regiment returned to its pre-war structure, with 2 regular battalions, a reserve battalion and 1 territorial battalion, with everything else being disbanded. And with that, the battalion resumed its peacetime activities, comprised of monthly drills and annual summer camps, even representing the regiment during regular army manoeuvres. From July 1919, the battalion became the 5th Battalion of the Bedfordshire and Hertfordshire Regiment as a result of the Hertfordshire Regiment being merged into the Bedfordshires, which title it would retain for the rest of its existence. At the 1922 annual camp in Cardington, the battalion were given a speech by the Chief of the Imperial General Staff, General the Earl of Cavan. In it, he made the memorable remark, "You men of Bedford, you began the war very little known. You ended the war the best known of the whole of the British line. No regiment has a finer record than you have." When the Second World War broke out in 1939, the battalion were again embodied for service, and 2 years later their division was lost when the Singapore garrison fell, with over a third of the Beds and Herts men captured dying in captivity. Several more administrative changes followed as the army scaled down after the war, until in 1967 the battalion was folded into the 5th Volunteer Battalion of the Royal Anglian Regiment, bringing to an end their 107 years of direct lineage.